Hello and welcome to Off the Fence, a podcast where we deconstruct difficult decision making to try to find out what keeps us stuck, and more importantly, how do we get unstuck? I'm your host, Karen Covey, a former divorce lawyer, mediator, and arbitrator turned coach, author, and entrepreneur. With me today, I have John Rodriguez, and John is the co-founder and fractional chief value officer of Hill Country Business Strategies, a company that provides strategic planning and financial planning for business owners who want to grow their business into a sellable asset. John has spent his whole life around privately held businesses, from growing up in the restaurant started by his immigrant father to becoming its second generation owner to coaching hundreds of founders into becoming more effective business owners. John is equal parts entrepreneur and advisor, and he's just as comfortable talking business with owners as he is talking planning with their advisors. John, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to it, Karen.
I'm excited because, and you and I know because we've talked a little outside of this, but I'm excited to have you on to talk about business because a lot of the clients that I work with are business owners, right? And they're going through a divorce and they're facing having to value the business and do something with the business. And that's where you come in. So let's talk. I know you're a specialist in helping small businesses plan an exit strategy. For
Mhm.
people who might not be familiar with that term, what does exit strategy mean?
So, exit strategy, really the easiest way to understand it is first you have to understand that exiting a business is very complicated. It can be a really lengthy process that can have a lot of variables in it and a lot of very significant consequences. So, what we do, my partner is also a certified exit planner. When we work with owners, we get them thinking about what they want that exit to look like because it's something that takes a lot of preparation. The owners that do take just selling their business for granted usually aren't able to, and they're met with a lot of disappointment when they just rush their business to the market and they have an idea in their head about what they want to sell their business for, what they want the terms to look like, and generally what the owners have in their head is not really the market reality. And our job is we never want any of our owners to get there. We want them to be very well educated on what to expect in the process of exiting their business, and we want them to be really happy with the outcome.
So let me ask you, if somebody is thinking that, long term down the road, I want to create this business into a sellable asset, right?
Mhm.
How much time should they give themselves before actually putting the business on the market? Like how soon before then should they start to get ready?
So it's going to depend on a couple of factors. Number one, it's going to depend on how much planning they've already done. We see some businesses where they have enough things in place where it can actually be done probably within a year. It's also going to depend on what their expectations are. What is the distance between where their business and their planning is at right now and what their expectations are. I generally tell people plan on about 3 years. That's typically what we see.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot of work that has to go into this. One of the mistakes that I think owners make, or one of the things that they take for granted, is that they make the assumption that because the business is successful for them, that is what makes it transferable to somebody else. And those are actually two very, very different characteristics.
Okay, I want to talk more about that because
Sure.
part of a lot of my clients have businesses, and some of them
Mhm.
have what I guess would be called a lifestyle business
Mhm.
where it runs because of them. But
Mhm.
as far as whether it's transferable, to your point, that's a better question. And
Mhm.
so in terms of divorce, you've got to value that asset, or does that asset have a value over and above the person who's running it? So
Mhm.
how do you figure that out? How do you figure out if the business is dependent on just this person, it's a lifestyle business, or it's something that's sellable?
Mhm. So that's a really nuanced question, and that's a lot of what my work is. The really simple answer is a very simple equation, which is you have your business, and then you have the business without you. And what's the difference in those things? I've seen businesses that were cash flowing millions of dollars that had zero equity value because the owner was so tied to the performance of the business, and the owner's knowledge, relationships just weren't transferable to somebody else. So there's kind of technical answer of, if we looked at the balance sheet and the P&Ls, and if we poured through, some of the market considerations, we have this value. The actual value of the business is how much of that value can exist independent of the owner. And that can be a really, really different number in a lot of cases.
That's so fascinating because a lot of times, obviously, okay, so you've got a divorce situation. Let's
Mhm,
just say it's this a situation where one spouse owns the business, the other one's not involved.
mhm,
And then the spouse who owns the business, of course, is going to say it's not worth anything. It's just me. And the other spouse is going to go, oh, yeah, right. So,
mhm.
how do you figure that out? How do you come to a value that that's meaningful?
So in that instance where we're not talking about an actual exit for the
Hmm.
owner or for one of the spouses that's involved in the business, this is a point where I would like to encourage everybody to engage a very good valuation expert. Valuations in the small business market are incredibly complicated and they require a lot of expertise to be done properly. I will tell you about 90% of the valuations I see are just complete fiction. They have nothing to do with the actual marketable, sellable value of a business. So I would encourage anybody can reach out to me. We work with very qualified valuators. Make sure that you're getting a valuation from an expert that specializes in valuation. The unfortunate reality is most of the valuations that are floating around out there are done by people that have no idea what actually happens in the transactional markets. They could be financial advisors, they could be CPAs, they could be insurance people. There's several platforms online where they can take 2 to 3 numbers, punch those in, and they can get a very fancy looking report that comes out the back end. That has almost nothing to do with what actually happens in the marketplace for small businesses.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm so surprised by that. But I do know that a business valuator, or I think that a
Mhm.
business valuator needs experience or expertise in whatever the industry is that the business is in, because it matters, doesn't it? If
It
you're
does.
evaluating like a restaurant versus a professional services corporation versus a manufacturing company, it all matters, right?
It does. Having experience within the industry, within the sort of size of the business, sometimes even within the geography is really important. If they are a certified valuation analyst, if they are a CVA, then they
Mhm.
have gone through training and they have to answer for the valuations they produce. I would say, just in my experience, I only see CVA valuations maybe 1 out of 20 times. Most of the times
Wow.
they're performed by other professionals.
Why would somebody go to a different kind of professional if the valuation that they're getting is garbage?
Um, I'm trying to be diplomatic. Those valuation tools are business development tools for other professionals, for financial advisors, for insurance people, sometimes even for business consultants. That's how they're sold. And sometimes those platforms can be useful, and I actually use them every now and then, but they're entirely dependent on the input. And that's what the problem is a lot of these platforms are advertised as, hey, you just need revenue and profit from the last 12 years, or for the last year or 12 months, you put it into here and then it spits out this valuation. And what I have to tell people a lot of the times is, believe me, when you go to sell a business, the qualified buyers on the other end are a lot more or they're interested in a lot more than just 2 numbers. So a lot of those platforms, even the ones that are good, they require the right kind of input on the front end, which is a lot more than just, 2 numbers from a tax return.
Yeah, let's talk about that input for a
Sure.
moment, because when people, if a couple is facing divorce and one of them owns a business, right? And the other spouse says, "Well, I want this business valued." What what's involved in getting a business valuation? What kind of data and numbers
Mhm.
does the valuator need from the business owner in order to make this valuation?
Sure. So they're going to need a couple things on just the pure numbers end. Well, let me back this up a little bit. So the way that people on the buy side are going to arrive at a valuation is actually a very simple equation. It's going to be your earnings times a multiple. That's about, I would say 95% of business transactions that are going to be above the fixed asset value of the business are
Mm-hmm.
going to be arrived at some version of that equation. That earnings number is going to come from the financial data in the business. And then that multiple that they're using is going to be a combination of what's happening in the marketplace and all of the intangible value of the business, if that makes sense. So you've probably heard people refer to valuations before as 1.25 times revenue, or maybe it's 6 times EBITDA, or maybe it's, what we're seeing in the market right now is, 4 to 6 times, SDE, things like that. They're all variations on that same really simple equation. So if you think about the left side of the equation, those earnings numbers are going to generally be some proxy for cash flow in the business. It's going to be EBITDA, it could be net income, it could be what's called seller's discretionary earnings. These are all nuanced metrics, and they're all a little bit different, but they're all designed to predict how much cash flow is going to come out of this business in 1 year. Is it 150,000? Is it 600,000? Is it 2 million?
So can a business owner, by the business decisions they make, affect that number? And here's what I mean. Let's say you had a business owner who owned hair salons,
Mhm.
right? And they decided in the year of the divorce that they were going to do all these capital improvements, which definitely would affect their cash flow, their debt load, their all that kind of thing. Does that really affect negatively the business valuation? Is it net equal because presumably they'll make more money when the improvements are done? How does that work?
So again, it's nuanced. It will all be factored in very carefully by either the buyer or by the buyer's team. Generally, really qualified buyers, uh, they want to understand these things at a high level, but they have professionals that are actually going to go in there and do a lot of the really nitty gritty kind of accounting work. Um, so the short answer is, number one, there's not that much on the balance sheet that most buyers are going to care about. That's just the reality. The way most businesses transact in this space is going to be as an asset sale. The buyers are going to be bringing their own cash and debt to the equation. So the debt or the retained earnings that the actual seller has on their balance sheet are going to be completely irrelevant to most buyers. They're just not going to be interested in it because they're not buying the past performance of the business. They're buying the future performance of it. So
Okay.
the debt that's on the balance sheet is not going to be a huge factor because, again, it's going to be the seller's responsibility to settle that debt. Most of the time, it's not going to be the buyer. I would say it's hard getting data on this because most private transactions aren't reported in any meaningful way. But in my experience, I would say about 95% of transactions, particularly in like the sub $5 million market, they're transacted as asset sales, meaning the buyer is only buying what they absolutely need for the business to function. And the reality is that's mostly going to live on the P&L and not on the balance sheet. So the things like how much cash you have in the bank, what does your debt load look like? Those things don't really matter to most buyers because the way I explain this to owners is, let's say, first off, it's the buyers that have all the leverage in this marketplace. It's not the sellers. Don't let a business broker or M&A advisor tell you otherwise. The qualified buyers are the ones that have all the leverage in this space. If I'm a qualified buyer, let's say I'm a financial buyer, I have a portfolio company and PE group, something like that. If I have two businesses and they both have the same expectations in the future, and they're doing 5 million top line, they're getting 1 million to the bottom line. Whether one of them has been around for 20 years and has a ton of retained earnings, or whether one's been around 10 years and has less, or whether this one has a big debt load or this one doesn't, that doesn't matter to the future performance because, again, it's going to be the buyers that are going to be bringing their own debt into the transaction.
Right.
They're going to be bringing their own cash. So all of these things that have accrued over time that aren't going to influence the future performance, it's not that meaningful for a buyer.
Well, now let's change the scenario a little bit and
Mhm,
say that, there's a couple, somebody, one of them owns a business, and they're not thinking of selling it in a divorce.
mhm,
One spouse, the spouse is just going to buy out essentially
mhm,
the other spouse's marital interest because the other spouse has no, they've never worked in the business, they've never
mhm,
done it, but the business, let's say some business valuator says the business is worth $1 million,
mhm,
right? So theoretically, 500,000 is the spouse's, right?
mhm.
So you've got this business. What happens? Where do businesses, if the business is the primary asset, right? If that's the only thing we're talking about, where do businesses, what are their options for coming up with the money to buy out the spouse?
Yeah, it's a good question. This is one of the problems my partner and I see all the time with buy-sell agreements is even if they outline a lot of the terms, they never have any mechanism to fund them. And if you actually don't have access to the capital to, make this transaction take place, the rest of it's all irrelevant. Um, these can come from a few different places. I mean, the easiest one is just capital on hand. That's difficult for most business owners. I
Right,
understand that.
right.
The other one is the buyout can be structured in such a way that it's not a lump sum. It can be paid over
Over
time from the
time.
cash flow of the business. The other option is, you can go to a third party and find lenders that will sometimes finance an arrangement like that. That's complicated, and it's really going to depend on the health of the business in that instance. If we do want to go to a bank and go, what does it look like for you to write this $500,000 check? So we don't have to worry about this. They have the security of that money, and then we're making debt payments for 4, 5, 6 years or whatever. Um, that scenario can put a lot of financial strain on the business a lot of the times. And lenders are risk averse by nature. And if you have a business that doesn't have adequate debt capacity to be able to take on a loan like that, then what's usually going to happen is that second scenario I outlined, where this is going to have to be paid over time from the
Yeah.
business, and it's less than ideal because the party that's being bought out now has to deal with all the future risk of what happens if something goes sideways in this business in 2 years. By the way, I don't control anything of it. That's really not the best scenario, but it's usually the one that most owners have to settle for.
Yeah. You mentioned buy sell agreement. What is
Yep.
that?
So a buy-sell agreement, and there's lots of different versions. It's basically just an agreement amongst shareholders or members of a business that's going to outline if one of us cannot remain in the business, doesn't want to remain in the business, let's outline the mechanics of how this person is going to leave the business and be bought out. That's the easiest way to think of it.
Okay, so if I understand it right, let's say that it's a business that has, a couple of partners or
Mhm,
shareholders, whatever, people co-own it.
mhm,
And one of those, the buy sell agreement would say, hey, if anybody wants out for whatever
mhm,
reason, um, would it set the price of the sale and that the other owners get the right to buy out that person's shares for X dollars?
mhm. It can. I generally don't like there being a price on a buy-sell agreement because it doesn't take into account what has happened in the business from the time it was written until what could be years later when they're actually effectuating a buyout. The best buy-sell agreements I see generally outline that there will be a third-party valuation done by a professional. The time of the buy-sell agreement or one that's, uh, been done in the last 180 days, one that's going to have some relevance. I think that's generally the best solution.
Okay, so I'm thinking in terms of, one person, let's say there are two people that are, or three people that are business owners together.
Mhm,
They have a buy sell agreement, and the agreement says that if somebody wants out, or, well, let me stop here. Can it be triggered by a divorce? Can we say that if somebody needs to sell their interest in
mhm.
because of a divorce, that the buy sell agreement kicks in?
It can be. It can be triggered by all kinds of things. It could be, we say the 5 Ds in my business, disagreement, disaster, divorce, death, or disability. So you
Oh,
can
geez.
outline all of those events, and that the more specific it is, the better. Those can all be outlined in a buy-sell agreement. It can also be, you can also have a trigger that is just one person wants to leave for whatever reason. Uh,
Yeah.
what I always tell the people I work with is, it can be a difficult conversation, but the more specific a buy-sell agreement can be, the better it's going to work.
Because it seems to me that if that buy sell agreement is in place, and let's say it says that we'll get a third party valuator, and whatever that third party valuator says, your percentage interest in the business based on that value is what we will pay you, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Um, if you put that in the context of a divorce, because a lot of the arguments in divorce over business is what is this really worth? And no, my valuator is better than your valuator, and blah, blah, blah. But if there's a buy sell agreement in place, it would seem to me that it would make it a whole lot more clear that,
Mhm.
you could, the husband and wife can say whatever they want to say, but this is the amount that the partners are going to pay for the business.
Mhm. And I will say again, if it's a certified, valuation expert, I, there's no way to come up with a perfect number. That there's too many variables. There's too much uncertainty in this marketplace, but it's going to be close. It's at least going to be a basis for grounding the rest of the conversations in some reality. Because I've seen instances where one partner says 50 million and the other one says 2 million. I mean, that they can
Hmm.
be wildly different. Getting that certified valuation is at least going to give everybody a baseline to start the rest of the conversations where everybody's at least in the same ballpark.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let's complicate life a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it's a husband and wife business,
Yep.
right? Which is, in my experience, one of the hardest situations because somebody is not only losing their marriage, they're probably going to lose their job
Mhm.
or their business, right? So, what happens when, I mean, I would think that in a husband wife business, a buy sell agreement is not worth much, or is it?
It can be. I mean, again, buy-sell agreements, I mean, from your background, those documents are in and of themselves not very valuable. It's really the specificity and the professionalism that's in those documents that's going to dictate whether they're actually useful. In my opinion, whether they're spouses, best friends, people that met 2 weeks ago, I think anytime that there is multiple stakeholders in a business, I think there's got to be something that they talk about at the front end that's going to address, hey, what if? Because those conversations, we were just talking about this before the show, coming to all of the decisions about what's going to happen when one person has to leave, when there's already some disagreement or there's some tension, it makes it so much more difficult. Like you said, trying to have two parties that are now separating come to an agreement on valuation. I mean, it's almost impossible.
So what happens in that instance? You've got two people, they can't agree on what the value of the business is, or they have overinflated ideas
Mhm.
about what the value is, and one of them, like neither one of them wants out,
Yeah.
right? What happens to the business?
A lot of times they both stay there, believe it or not.
Ooh, oh my.
Yeah, because it's really the option of last resort. They don't have any means to pay somebody to leave the business. They might be dependent on the income. The business might not have a lot of sellable value, and they end up remaining business partners despite not being married anymore.
So I would think, I mean, just from, as you said, from my background in the law,
Yeah.
like that is you need everything spelled out in a written agreement,
Yes.
which would be over and above your divorce papers, right? This is
Yeah.
an ongoing business relationship
Mm.
that should probably lay out what are the terms? What if someone wants to get out? Like what are the buy sell terms of that? And what is everybody's role? What is everybody's job? How does this work, right?
Mhm. And I've seen scenarios too where it's not just the only option available. A lot of the times, neither one of them want to give up the business. They're both
Right.
attached to it. They both like their jobs. They both feel like that business or the success in it is due to their effort and they don't want to walk away from it. I mean, I have seen it work. There are times where it can work, but again, I think the real value for everybody that's listening to this is to start thinking about these things before you find yourself in that situation, and really thinking about, like, if the worst does happen, like, what do we want life to look like? What do we want this business to look like? The earlier those conversations can happen, the better.
And what kind of, because I would think that one of the important things when
Mhm,
you're selling a business, whether or selling your interest in it, whether it's divorce, death, you just want to
mhm,
sell the business no matter what,
mhm,
is to have the right legal paperwork in place,
mhm,
like to have that buy sell agreement, to have, whatever operating agreements you
mhm,
need to be in place on the front end. And I also know from having worked with plenty of small business owners and being one myself that oftentimes that paperwork is sorely lacking.
mhm,
So what would you say to people, like, what if they're already in the business, things are going, but it's kind of on a shoestring, like things are not, the i's aren't dotted and the t's aren't crossed? What would you tell a business owner in that circumstances? What kinds of paperwork and agreements do they need to have in place that are going to serve them, whether they ultimately sell the business together or whether something happens in the business is imploding, right?
mhm. I think the biggest one is that buy sell agreement. That is first and foremost. Sometimes I'll see buy sell language incorporated into operating agreements or into shareholder agreements. It really needs to be a separate document. It needs to live on its own. That to me is the most important one, because the way I explain it to the owners I work with and the advisors I work with is that buy sell agreement it's like a valve. If things aren't going well in the relationship, whether it's spouses, business partners, friends, whatever it is, that buy sell agreement takes all that pent up pressure and just releases all of it. We know how this is going to be handled. We've talked about it, we've been in agreement about it, and now we can just go through this difficult process, but with some agreement and with some clarity on what it looks like. When you don't have that release valve, everything just becomes more tense. It gets more difficult to do. Coming to an agreement gets, infinitely harder. And, I see a lot of scenarios where you have a pretty good business and then there's something like this that happens, whether it's a divorce, there's something unexpected that happens personally. It could be the death or disability of, one of the partners. When something like that happens, we don't have that mechanism in place. Um, it can go on for years. I mean, you can have a business that is just in this turmoil where there's this one partner that has their own attorney, and every month there's something that happens. I mean, this can be a huge disruption and a huge distraction to a business. I've seen this process literally take years. And the reality is, when the process takes that long, if that exiting partner or shareholder is vital to the business is going to go to zero before any agreement comes to place, usually.
Wow. So basically, I mean, it can tank the business.
It can very easily, very easily. One of the realities about this space, and one of the things that I have to talk to owners about, is I sometimes have to get them to understand that their business is probably a lot more fragile than they realize. That taking one key person out of this business can just have an enormous impact on the financial viability and the value of the business, and it can happen almost overnight.
Wow, that is, it's a little scary, actually.
It is. I mean, the way I explain this, I think, I've owned businesses. I've always been an entrepreneur, and I think it's really easy to underestimate sometimes the impact that the owner or a key partner in a business can have over what happens there day to day.
Mhm.
Um, the way I explain it to owners is, I go, look, let's say you go to an island for a month and don't bring your phone. What happens to your business? And that's a really easy way to kind of frame it, because I think that's a good reality check, that, like, what is business really going to look like for those couple of weeks? What are the problems that aren't going to get solved? What are the leaks that are going to happen, to revenue, to profit? That can be a big eye opener for a lot of business owners.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm spinning in my head thinking
Yeah.
about it right now.
Yeah.
And thinking about, for those people. So if there's a couple and they're business owners and they're thinking that they're building the next big thing, that they're going to sell it for, they're going to build it and sell it for millions of dollars, some new app or tech thing,
Yeah.
right? Um, what would you advise them to do now while they're still getting along, that will give them the best chance of actually getting to their goal someday? Because part of what you do is not just, in the moment of, okay, we're going to sell now, but
Yeah.
you help people plan, because
Mhm.
it, like you said, it takes a long time. So what kinds of things should people be doing in their business today, whether they're thinking of divorce or not, that
Mhm.
will help not divorce proof their business, but that will strengthen their business, so that whether they want to sell it, whether they want to sell their interest in it, whether it's a divorce or a death or any of your D's, they're
Yep.
in the best position possible to do that.
It's a great question. The place I always start is I want to get a really good sense of what success looks like for them. Not just today, down the road. Like and I think this is part of a symptom of being, an entrepreneur and probably having ADHD, like most entrepreneurs do. But whenever I ask that question to an owner, about 90% of the time, they'll give me an answer that doesn't have enough specificity to it to be an actual goal. So I'll ask an owner, what do you want ultimately from your business? They'll say retirement, or I want to hit 5 million in revenue. They'll give me these sort of milestones that don't tell me anything about why that's important to them. So getting an owner to think, forget about 5 million in revenue. What are you going to do with that? What is that going to do for your life and your long-term planning? Well, I want to buy a boat. Okay, great. Now we're getting somewhere. What kind of boat do you want? Why do you want to buy a boat? What do you want to do with it? Getting a lot of clarity around what this business is ultimately going to provide them that's going to be successful. That's where I start with every owner. I don't let any owner tell me retirement. I don't know what retirement means. You can probably retire today. Go lock your shop up and you're retired. What are you doing in retirement? What does it look like? What does your lifestyle look like? Getting a lot of clarity around those things. Instead of saying retirement, saying, I want the freedom to be able to travel 3 months out of the year. I'd like to work 15 to 20 hours a week in a more executive capacity in my business. I want my business to look like this because it's important to me as its founder. Those are goals. So once we get our heads wrapped around what success really looks like, that's when we can start building the roadmap backwards. That's really what my job is we go, okay, we know exactly what you want life to look like in the future, and we know exactly what your business is right now. Let's start filling in the gaps. Whether it is more revenue, more profit, whether it's headcount, whether it's the impact of the business, whether it's just freeing you up so you can play golf 3 times a week, whatever that is. I cannot, and no other advisor on the planet can do this either. They cannot they cannot build you a meaningful roadmap without having a really clear goal of what that destination is. So that's always where I start.
Oh my gosh, you are like, I'm getting so excited here. You are
Yeah.
preaching to the choir,
Yeah.
right? And it's
Yeah.
fascinating to me that the exact same thing that you're saying about business is what I say to my clients about divorce. What
Yeah.
do you want your life to look like? You don't
Yeah.
want divorce to be the defining moment of your
Yes.
life, right? And
Mhm.
people will say, well, I want to be happy. Great. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Happy can mean 100 million different things to, every different person.
Yeah.
So I love that you start with the goals, because if you don't know what you want and you don't know why it matters to you, then you'll just sort of float around and whatever
Yeah.
happens is going to happen.
That's what most small business owners do, unfortunately. So I have a slide in one of the decks I use with this where it sort of looks like a pyramid. When most business owners think long term, their initial thinking is almost always going to be about retirement, or it's going to be about some financial, benefit, whether it's selling for X, getting this and that proceeds. That's where they always start. But then as you start kind of peeling back the onion, you start having these conversations, that's when it starts to really spread out. And you can find out that you had two business owners that had, really similar businesses, and they both said, I want to retire with $5 million. You start picking at that a little bit and you can find out they actually want two completely different things. This person wants to get a check for $5 million so that he can donate it to his church. This person wants a check for $5 million because they want to go set up a venture where they're an incubator to help other founders or something. Those two goals that sounded identical and those two businesses that looked identical, they're going to have completely different strategies because what they actually want is something completely different than just, a $5 million business.
Yeah, that makes, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. And as a business owner myself, like I could sit here and talk to you for hours, but in consideration of your time, I just want to say, ask you one last question. If
Sure.
you have a couple and things aren't going well and they're wondering if they're going to go down the road of divorce, but they own a business together, do you have any last words of wisdom that you would share with them for how they can do this and have their own personal exit strategies,
Mhm.
in a way that doesn't kill the business?
So I think the easiest way to think of it is, let's imagine how difficult divorce would be, personally, emotionally. I mean, firsthand, how difficult that is. Imagine having to deal with all of these other things with the business and with income and with figuring out. Think about how much worse that experience is going to be. And then think about how much worse the outcome is if the business doesn't survive.
That's a really good point and a way to put it, because a lot of people, whether, there's the issue of the business value that's got to
Yeah.
be divided as an asset, but there's also the income issue, which we haven't even
Yes.
talked about.
Hmm.
And, if you've got two spouses that one of them is going to be unemployed because they're out of the
Hmm.
business, right? Now you've got disparate income and they're both going to still be relying on the business for
Hmm.
that income directly or indirectly. So this is such an important
It
conversation.
is. It is. It
John,
is.
thank you so much. Where can people find you if they've got questions, if they're looking for a business valuator, if they're looking for somebody to help them build their exit strategy, where do they find
Mhm.
you?
Go to hillcobiz.com. That's HILLCOBIZ. We have a contact form on there. You can just go in there, drop me a line. You can also find me on LinkedIn. Those are probably the two best places. And anybody that has any questions, always happy to talk to anybody about this. You can email me. It's john@hillcobiz.com. Yeah, I could talk about this stuff all day.
Yeah, well, thank you for talking about it here with me. This has been a fascinating conversation. I have truly enjoyed it.
Good, good. Thanks again for having me on. I appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. And for those of you out there who are listening or who are watching, if you enjoyed today's conversation, if you want more conversations like this, do me a big favor. Give this video a thumbs up, give the podcast a thumbs up, like, subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.